一个星期的华尔街论坛和大家不见不散。后面是更多其他的内容。
这是江泽民的第2件事情，第3件事情。
第3个事情，他军委当2年军委主席，这是
对不下来。
我说了，我在国外不管怎么样嘛，还小
不上马，生一桶，他就是不放权嘛，带胡锦涛，
对吧？这个你不是邓小平，邓小平是军委主席又干了一段，对吧？全部职务期之后，这个因为我在国外做评论过，谈过问题，就是基本没失误过的，这个算我失手了，所以我说了一个我无能，他无耻，这个非常不好啊。这个书里我回去之后，中办找我了，我没有啊，我说和平过这个，在说的时候，我说我不敢说，我说我是无能没人说我无耻，有人说我无能，对吧？啪多页，真我就给我写了我无能无耻，我说不好意思，当时笔误，你跟首长道歉，这个确实我不该这么说，我说真有那页，就是关于他在当2年军委主席的时候，我说我无能，他无耻，他拿着白纸黑字就跟他说有这话，中办拿出来了。
江泽民看了这个吗？
我不是看没看，反正是他不一定这么仔细，但是他下面的秘书，下面那班子人看得很仔细，我都忘了，对吧？600页，
对，
其中每页又是20-30行，对吧？每行又是30个字，这俩字他们看着了，说了我不承认呢，没有，我说看着我说和平上说了，我没敢说，我说我是，对吧？无能，好多人说我无能，但没人说我无耻。我记得他们讨论的时候，我说不敢说的话嘛，啪多页拿出来了，那我承认跟首长道歉吧，就是，但这个事确实是非常不好的。人家说胡锦涛有学长嘛，10年无作为，一朝裸退有情史，是吧？10年碌碌无作为嘛，其实是1年多，但是这点他是中共党史上第一个
把权力交得彻底干干净净，
是主动的，开玩笑，不像我们敬爱赵子阳同志是被动的撤得干干净净的，开玩笑，那是真的，对吧？确实，假如江泽民当时要这么做的话，就没锦涛事了，他就是中共历史上第一个人。
对，但是对，
你遥控嘛，你对不对？你选几个好的军委副主席，你控制得了吧？不行，你那个对吧？
他也搞得非常狼狈。
是啊，非常没
狼狈到什么程度呢？就是你地方上打报告报告党中央、国务院，比如说上海市委报告中央什么事情，他不能写中央中委主席呀，所以呢就被人耗得很荒唐。胡锦涛一看到这个文件应该给泽民同志看一看，所以就说请泽民同志看一看，你理解吗？这个文本
政府怎么给中央军委主席
打
报告啊？
所以呢，很多地方的资料这都是由胡锦涛批给这个江泽民，很多人不大了解我呢是大概了解这个能力嘛，
对，是很被动的，
很被动，很狼狈，所以耗得他搞得很无趣，
对呀，
所以就只好退下来了。
我觉得一点意思没有吧？是吧？
对，
就是你高明点，你遥控嘛，对不对？你让你那个贾庆林是吧？你就一个这个电子部小秘书嘛，也上将了，跟那个
不是贾庆林，贾庆安，
对，不好意思老年痴呆，
那是电子工业部部长的时候呢，在走廊上看到一个小伙子，怎么没有座位啊？他们说，哎呀，当时中央机关很多地方都没有办公室啊，对，能够在走廊上放一张桌子是不错了。让他把小贾就叫到里面去聊聊天，聊天，这个小伙子不错，就成为了他的秘书，然后他就类似于这个王岳林的角色。
对呀，王岳林是原来是警卫秘书，当过兵的，都不当兵的，对吧？老板和那个下面秘书都没当过兵，江泽民1天兵没当过，贾庆安是吧？贾庆安1天兵没当过，好也上将，也跟那个邓小平那个王仁学，
对，
不能学嘛。假如你新学也可以啊，给他弄个军委副主席，进遥控，你就彻底退得了嘛。
你之前去八一大楼有没有见到贾庆安呀？
没有。
你可能也忘记了。
对，但是我说写了好几个写信，他就是告我这途径，中央办公厅贾庆安是我下面写上延托。这样他就知道了，他就不看，就那大新闻的小新闻就给降了。这个我这么办过，我这边写了，我妹妹这么办过，一个叫这个
就是跟江写信什么事情？
对，他是弘扬这个就是这个国际货币组织的成员，在中国被判了10年徒刑。然后我当时在新加坡，我不认识的事儿，我就写了，不能随便抓国际组织这个国际组织的雇员，也要准外交人员的性质了，对吧？你要这么随便抓，谁那个世界银行啊，谁敢到怎么派人去的，对不对？结果他是我妹妹同学，我妹妹通过途径呢，贾田案子转给江，结果10几年就变成5年了。咱们我讲事情，我们讲肯定是起作用了。做了5年，这个弘扬还不干，还在那个要上诉，人说，别闹了，你待不了5年的，你去打招了，就3年就出去了。就我不说是我讲事情，我不讲肯定是归因不好归，但是确实就是我讲嘛，就讲这个，我写了封信，就是我是书上写了，就他以为是我那个发行人严某好像说的事儿，我没有，发行人对我举例子了，像民营出版社这发行人，像金钟发行人，我这个发行人嘛，对吧？他有化名说他坏话似的，他来讲那个当时那个谁呀，就是日本那个杨什么写的，这个乔石其人讲的事儿，有些事儿他们那个探索知道是了，他以为只有我知道给说出去的，就只能说我不该化名在外面就是说的坏话，我说没那回事，我这发行人我哪搞发行人呢？是何老板，那是金钟老板的发行人
，OK，
给 copy 给他看了，对，就这个事儿。
OK， 好，第4件事情有没有？
哎呦，10把手说恩人的坏话，是不是？我是绞尽脑汁呢。我提过我特别觉得这3个代表好，说没说过？说好话行不行
？OK，
第4个就，不该让我回去。6年我回去呢，这6年你看了对吧？这个我说出来了，这6年没少的乱。最后一个事儿是20大，他给写封信是吧？这个在20大一片寂静之声，先是诺诺，不如一是俄。
这个事情我们以后再说。我们。
大家好，欢迎来到我们的6度探索节目。今天我们要带大家深入了解缅甸北部地区的最新局势。7月3日，缅甸北部地区军事指挥部附近爆发了冲突，这可能是针对军政府军队的一次扩大攻势。自2日晚间以来，掸邦首府腊戍一直响起枪声，居民不敢出门，军方封锁了所有通往该地的道路。这场冲突的背景是由德昂军、若开军和缅甸民主同盟军结成的3家兄弟联盟组织去年10月对腊戍附近和中国边境沿线发动的攻势。此外，缅甸还面临高温和极端天气的双重打击。今年4月的气温创下历史新高，极端高温加剧了难民营的生活苦难。2021年以来的冲突已经导致超过12。缅甸的局势日益复杂，军政府部队与少数民族和反军政府武装组织之间的战斗在多地爆发，并且愈演愈烈。在这样的背景下，缅甸的未来将会如何发展？大家是否还记得并关注缅甸北部人民的苦难？请大家继续收看详细内容。缅甸北部地区军事指挥部附近7月3日爆发冲突，这可能是针对军政府军队的一次扩大攻势。法新社报道，一名居民说，自2日晚间以来，缅军指挥部所在的掸邦北部城镇腊戍一直响起枪声。要求匿名的当地居民说，自7月2日晚上起，位于掸邦首府腊戍的缅军指挥部就一直响起枪声，大家都不敢出门。另一名居民说，此次冲突发生在城外，军方已封锁通往腊戍的所有道路，但镇上的一些商铺仍开门营业。另一名居民告诉记者，战斗发生在城外。记者在与他的通话里听到一声爆发声。他说，军方已经封锁通往腊戍的所有道路，但镇上一些商店仍在营业。上传到社交媒体的视频显示，一座木质建筑被毁，部分建筑起火。当地媒体报道称，有6名平民在炮击中丧生。仰光机场一名消息人士告诉法新社，自3日早上以来，从仰光飞往腊戍的所有航班均已取消，但没有透露更多细节。 由德昂军、若开军和缅甸民主同盟军结成的兄弟联盟组织，去年10月对腊戍附近和中国边境沿线的军方发动攻势，他们占领大片领土和利润丰厚的过境点，给军政府带来自2021年政变夺权以来的最大打击。今年1月12日，经中国斡旋，缅军与果敢军、德昂军和若开军的代表在中国云南昆明和谈，但仅2天后，3家兄弟指政府军违反停火协议，缅军则否认，并称3家兄弟旨在破坏停火协议。上个月底，德昂军在掸邦和邻近的曼德勒地区发动新的袭击。另一方面，根据缅甸气象与水文局发布的最新数据显示，今年4月份，缅甸全国有超过10个地区的日最高气温突破了当地气象站的历史记录。长期跟踪缅甸局势的外交学者网站5月最新援引分析人士的话报道称，缅甸的冲突已进入一个新的、更为复杂的阶段。早前慈善组织清洁阳光创始人 Z 尔瘫在卡车里装满水，准备运送到饱受军事冲突蹂躏的缅甸东部干旱山区的难民手中。极端高温加剧了难民营地的生活苦难。央视新闻5月4日的报道称，刚刚过去的4月份成为缅甸自有气温记录以来最炎热的4月。来自气象部门的预报称，受厄尔尼诺现象影响，直到5月中下旬，缅甸全境不仅会面临持续的高温天气，而且部分地区还将会出现异常降雨、风暴频发以及干旱等极端天气状况。在缅甸东南部的克耶邦一处难民营内，难民奥古斯塔 Gas 在一张塑料布搭建的屋顶下，等待着志愿者援助运送过来的38公升水。这是他家人接下来3天用于饮用、烹饪和洗涤需求的量。法新社的报道写道，缅甸政府军与民族武装组织在该邦的军事冲突，加之近期部分地区高达48度的气温，进一步加剧了水资源的短缺。联合国统计数据称，2021年以来，军事冲突导致超过12.3万人逃离了克耶邦的家园。2021年2月，缅甸全国民主联盟民盟高层昂山素季被扣押。缅甸军方领导人敏昂莱博的政权宣布国家进入紧急状态，并成立国家管理委员会，随后宣布废除大选结果，成立看守政府。此后，民盟在各地成立人民保卫军，由民第5进行军事训练。对此，缅甸军方也在全国各地增加驻军，以维持稳定。自2023年10月下旬以来，军政府部队与少数民族和反军政府武装组织联盟之间的战斗在缅甸大部分地区爆发。据新华网的消息，11月9日，缅甸军方成立的国家管理委员会主席敏昂莱称，现在是国家的重要时刻，全体人民都应支持政府军。如果处理不力，缅甸可能分裂。该委员会在2023年11月12日证实，国防军与多个武装组织在北部掸邦及周边的克耶邦和什阶省等地区均发生交战。今年1月，缅甸国家管理委员会宣布，自2月1日起继续延长国家紧急状态6个月，这已是第5次被延长。联合国开发计划署今年4月11日发布题为《缅甸的贫困和家庭经济正在消失的中产阶级》的报告称，在冲突地区，由于房屋被毁、进入农田受到限制，以及境内流离失所人口增加等因素，不稳定和经济困难加剧，贫困程度恶化。此外，贫困正在向城市地区蔓延，影响到仰光和曼德勒等曾经富裕的地区。而自西都，该报告对缅甸各地的12000多个家庭进行了调查，系近年来进行的最大规模全国性调查之一。进入4月，军政府部队与少数民族和反军政府武装组织联盟之间在多地有战斗扩大和升级的消息不断传出。据央视新闻客户端4月5日报道，缅甸国家管理委员会当天发布消息说，当天中午，缅甸中部曼德勒市一镇区的移民与人口办公厅遭到反政府武装分子使用自制炸弹袭击，已导致2人死亡、9人受伤，其中包括多名工作人员。此前一天，参考消息援引法新社报道，缅甸军政府的反对者4日对军方打造的首都内比都发动了无人机袭击，这是对军方权力中心的罕见袭击。缅甸军政府称，恐怖分子的13架固定翼无人机瞄准了重要建筑和部门。军政府的情报小组在一份声明中说，2架无人机在空中被摧毁，其余的都被击落。他还说，其中4架载有爆炸物， 声明说，这4架是在受控爆炸中被摧毁的，袭击没有造成人员伤亡或财产损失。据报道，缅甸民族团结政府说，他与当地一支人民国防军部队一起实施了袭击。缅甸民族团结政府在脸书上表示，此次袭击的目标是军方总部和内比都的一个空军基地。他还说，初步报告显示，袭击造成了人员伤亡。据机场一位不愿透露姓名的消息人士称，事件发生后，内比都机场在当地时间上午10时左右暂时关闭。近日来，缅甸内比都首都、仰光、曼德勒等大城市频繁发生袭击与炸弹爆炸事件。华盛顿特区国家战争学院教授扎卡里·阿布扎表示，对首都的袭击旨在打击军政府的士气。他对主要报道亚太地区时政新闻的英文刊物《外交学者》说，对内比都的无人机和火箭袭击几乎没有造成物理损失或人员伤亡，但造成了心理打击。今年可能是关键性年份。同样在4月初，在西部边境的若开邦，缅甸军方和民族地方武装组织若开军之间持续有半年的战斗，烈度达到了前所未有的水平。成立于2009年的若开军自2015年起与国防军发生战斗，是最近在缅甸东北地区夺取战略领土的3兄弟会联盟（简称 3BH） 成员，也是民族地方武装组织中训练有素、装备精良的一支。若开邦是缅甸最贫穷的地区之一，与孟加拉国接壤。据新华社此前报道，当地信奉佛教的若开族人和信奉伊斯兰教的罗兴亚人长期不和。2017年若开邦发生冲突后，大批民众逃往孟加拉国避乱，引发全球关注。同样，据央视新闻客户端4月报道，缅甸国家管理委员会发布消息说，4月17日下午，位于若开邦的反政府武装分子向布迪当镇东北方向发射重型武器，炮弹落入当地社区，导致4名平民死亡，8人重伤，伤者中包括1名12岁儿童，伤者已被安全部队送往当地医院救治。有报道称，战斗进入5月仍在持续。同样在西部的青邦，参考消息网4月26日援引德新社的报道称，缅甸军方25日晚间对与印度接壤的叛军控制区发动猛烈空袭，多枚炸弹落在青邦敏达镇，当地至少有4人死亡，15人重伤。该报道称，该地区在2022月缅甸发生军事政变后不久，就出现了反政府军抵抗军政府的行动。据称，青族防卫军目前控制着该地区的多个区域。而更为引发关注的是发生在缅甸东南部紧邻泰国边界的克伦邦的战事。4月11日，克伦民族联盟一度宣布，驻扎在妙瓦底的缅甸军政府部队已经撤出他们的阵地。妙瓦底意为绿宝石之地，是克伦邦的城市，也是该国最大的城市之一，人口超过20万，是缅泰间的重要边境贸易据点。缅甸商务部最新统计数据显示，2023年4月至2023年3月，缅甸陆路边境贸易总额的约14%经过妙瓦底，总计约11.5亿美元。据参考消息网援引法新社的报道称，19日晚，妙瓦底爆发新一轮战斗，反政府武装组织驱逐困在边境桥口的缅甸政府军，双方的交火一直持续到21日早上。驻守在泰缅边境的泰国军队20日凌晨称，武装力量采用无人机攻击躲藏在第2友谊大桥下的士兵。这座大桥是缅甸政府军的一个主要据点。但几天之后，据参考消息网4月24日援引新加坡联合早报报道称，在缅甸政府军发动反攻后，反政府武装组织克伦民族联盟从妙瓦底镇暂时撤退。克伦民族联盟将摧毁向妙瓦底进军的政府部队及其后备部队。克伦民族联盟的一名发言人24日说，没有透露下一步将采取什么行动。克伦民族联盟的发言人索塔尼说，缅甸军政府是在一支地区民兵的帮助下进入妙瓦底，而这支民兵在4月初克伦民族联盟围攻妙瓦底时袖手旁观。泰国方面24日也证实说，双方的战斗已经缓和。泰国外交部发言人尼康德表示，情况已显著改善，我们还在密切关注局势，局势仍然存在高度不确定性。据泰国媒体消息，泰缅边境妙瓦底第2友谊大桥已从4月30日起重新开放。不过，英文刊物《外交学者》5月初援引分析人士的话报道称，缅甸的冲突已进入一个新的、更为复杂的阶段。文章援引本地分析师的话称，各大反政府武装力量之间的协调和团结成为新阶段的重要考验。今年可能是关键性年份，将塑造冲突未来的走势。 知名缅甸问题分析师、美国和平研究所客座研究员伊马尤罕最新发布的缅甸战局评估报告写道，另一方面，缅甸北部的洪水已将数千人困在家中，并导致电力和电话线被切断，而国家气象局警告将有更多暴雨。苏伊康纳凯大期，克钦邦北部城市密兹纳连日大雨过后，伊洛瓦底江的水位已超过危险水位。当地媒体的照片显示，建筑物被淹没，人们在其景深的水中跋涉，头顶扛着财物。密兹纳的一名居民告诉法新社，水位上涨得非常快，许多居民仍被困在家中，并补充到，电力和电话网络自星期日以来一直处于瘫痪状态。他也表示，镇上出现了燃料短缺，救援人员在用摩托艇救援时面临很大的困难。另5位密兹纳居民说，他家的底层被水淹没了，他和邻居们一起躲避淹水，直到救援队赶到。而截至周二早，洪水已略有退却，但雨仍在下。当地媒体称，洪水已将数千人困在家中，国家气象局警告，未来数日将有更多豪雨。报道称，在下游第2大城市曼德勒，伊洛瓦底江的水位在7月上旬可能上升6至10英尺。屋漏偏逢连夜，缅北的人民长期生活在永无止境的天灾与人祸中，有多少人依然还记得他们？有多少人还愿意为他们发声？谢谢大家收看亚洲大眼睛，这是一个由科学家、经济学家、媒体人、工程技术人员合作建立的新型媒体。网友与6度来参与合作完成各种内容，这些内容不能作为任何决策或法律的意见。这是一个新型的试验性媒体方式，我们希望得到大家的支持，修正错误。网友可以参与讨论，也可以向万能的6博士提出你能想出的任何问题。6度世界网址是6度，我有请介绍给你的亲朋好友。
想成为全球沟通达人吗？6度人工智能语音克隆技术帮你实现梦想。在这个新时代，语言障碍已成过去，我们隆重推出6度人工智能语音克隆系统。这项由欧美亚顶尖专家研发的突破性技术，让你可以克隆自己的声音，并将文字转换成145种语言和方言，提升你的个人和职业生活。想象一下，你可以在日本参加商务会议，在巴西上课，或与意大利的朋友畅聊，而这一切都用你自己的声音、他们的语言进行。操作简单，只需点击几下，无需复杂的科技知识，就能享受无缝衔接的体验，让世界向你敞开。从商务到教育，从媒体到娱乐，应用场景无处不在。企业可以更好地与全球客户建立联系。教育机构可以提供多语言学习，媒体可以创作更丰富的内容，触达更广泛的受众。今天就来体验这项革命性技术吧。访问：迈向你的声音无国界的未来。
While preparing today's remarks, I read up a bit on the man that this lecture series honors, the late Lee Byung-chul, who went by B.C. Lee. B.C. Lee, of course, is best known for founding Samsung, the Korean conglomerate that holds such a critical position in the world's high-tech economy today. But what struck me was that he was able to build, in spite of the evidence that convulsed Korea across the span of the 20th century. He was able to build something pretty special. B.C. Lee was born in the year that Japan's colonial rule over Korea began in 1910. Lee lived through both world wars, the Korean War, the military coup d'etat and political assassinations that sometimes marked the post-war period until democracy ultimately prevailed in Korea, at least the southern half. And yet Lee and his company managed to survive and prosper. When Lee was around 40 years old, the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin approved and sponsored North Korean soldiers invading South Korea. Stalin then backed Mao, as Mao sent Chinese soldiers into the war after the United States and South Korea and their allies pushed back the invasion. I wonder what B.C. Lee would make of the fact that today the Chinese dictator Xi Jinping approved and now sponsors Russian soldiers that are invading Europe, with North Korea providing not only massive quantities of artillery shells and ballistic missiles, but also combat units, soldiers, as we've just learned, to help try and conquer Ukraine. B.C. Lee might have thought to himself, here we go again. As with the Korean War, deterrence would have been a whole lot cheaper than the major war that it's now playing out in Ukrainian cities, territorial seas, and rural battlefields. And as with the Korean War, this war probably could have been deterred. For a while, most of the rest of the 20th century, in fact, deterrence was something that the United States got better at. The Cold War stayed cold, after all. And true, there were proxy wars and America's painful decade in Vietnam, but the United States was able to prevent armed conflicts between great powers and to contain the small wars before they could cascade into pan-regional conflagrations. Yet today, in the 2020s, the deterrence of aggressive dictators is looking like a long-lost art. Vladimir Putin, unfazed by Washington's threats of sanctions, assaulted the capital of Ukraine and plunged Europe into its most destructive conflict since World War II. Iran equipped Hamas to initiate a war with Israel, and once the war had started, mobilized several of its other terrorist proxy groups in Lebanon, Yemen, Syria, and Iraq to rocket Israel, attack commercial shipping in the Red Sea, target U.S. warships, and fatally strike a U.S. military unit in the Kingdom of Jordan. After the rampage by Hamas, Beijing intensified its long-standing campaign to impose military control over the West Philippine Sea. Chinese sailors wielding axes and knives just recently forcibly boarded Philippine government vessels and confiscated 2 Philippine boats, an action that injured several Philippine sailors, and by my reading at least, meets the U.S. definition of an attack sufficient to trigger our defense treaty obligations to the Philippines. Venezuela's dictator, just weeks after Washington removed some of its sanctions on him, returned the favor by threatening to annex much of Venezuela's oil-rich neighbor, Guyana. And in a bold reprisal of Soviet mischief during the Cold War, Beijing is expressing sympathy for Venezuela's position while also developing Chinese military and intelligence facilities in Cuba. North Korea has resumed testing intercontinental ballistic missiles for the first time in more than 5 years, and as I just mentioned, supplies arms and munitions and now even soldiers for Russia's war in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin visited North Korea recently and established a military pact that appears to obligate the two countries to fight together in offensive, not just defensive wars. And at the center of this new axis of chaos is by far the most powerful member, the People's Republic of China, under the single-party dictatorship led by Xi Jinping. Beijing is the top economic, material, diplomatic, and propaganda supporter of this axis. And Beijing is steadily ratcheting up pressure on Taiwan as it builds the military capacity to be able to invade that island democracy. Deterring Beijing from pursuing that catastrophic adventure is the subject of my book, The Boiling Moat, Urgent Steps to Defend Taiwan, which published just yesterday. But I'd like to take a minute to discuss one lesson of history that the United States has forgotten, in the hope that revisiting history can help us regain our competency at deterrence. And this lesson may sound counterintuitive. I wouldn't have believed it myself a couple of decades ago when I was working as a journalist in China, writing for the Wall Street Journal. And before I had the privilege of serving in the U.S. military, and before I'd expanded my reading list of history beyond the sometimes thin college syllabi. But this counterintuitive lesson is that there is no such thing as an accidental war. Truly. Understanding this historical reality would alter how our own leadership calculates risk, and it would arm us with some insights that could help us shore up deterrence. For one, it would help us put to rest the fallacy that deterrence is provocative, that deterrence causes wars. You read variations of this idea frequently in the press. It would also help us stiffen our backbones in the face of potential aggression, and to remember that gestures of goodwill that involve weakening our military posture tend to invite, not defuse, the aggressive designs of dictators. President Biden told Xi Jinping more than a dozen years ago, when both men were vice presidents, that, quote, the only thing worse than a war is an unintentional war, close quote. As president, Biden and some of his cabinet-level officers have repeated that phrase numerous times over the past few years, including in the context of the Taiwan Strait, where U.S. and Taiwanese and Chinese military ships and planes are coming into closer proximity with one another. Secretary of State Tony Blinken, in a major policy address about China in May of 2022, said the following, quote, we've prioritized crisis communications and risk reduction measures with Beijing to help prevent an unintended conflict. Military accidents, of course, do happen, sometimes with lethal results, and it's prudent to establish guardrails to try to prevent them and their escalation. But a military mishap is a good example of something that might serve as a pretext for war, but not a cause of war. And there is a huge difference. Quote, no wars are unintended or accidental, close quote. That's a line from the Australian historian Geoffrey Blaney, who wrote that in his seminal book, The Causes of War, back in 1988. Quote, what is often unintended is the length and bloodiness of the war. Defeat also is unintended. But Blaney meticulously investigated the causes of all the wars spanning the preceding 4 centuries before he drew that shocking conclusion. There are other notable historians who came to a similar verdict. The late scholar and British parliamentarian Evan Luard conducted a detailed study of the wars from the 14th century to the 20th century. The American Enterprise Institute's defense scholar Corey Shackey, who wrote a useful essay on this topic last summer, points out that Luard, quote, did not turn up a single case of accidental inception of a war. Michael Howard, the celebrated Oxford and Yale professor of military history, similarly found zero evidence for unintended wars. Quote, if history shows any record of accidental wars, I have yet to find them, Howard wrote. Like President Biden, many diplomats and journalists assume that more hotlines and communication channels with Beijing are key to preventing a mishap from spiraling into war. And I have nothing against communication hotlines and communications. But what they fail to recognize is that if war follows a military mishap, it wouldn't be because of a misunderstanding. Quite the opposite. It would be because Beijing has made an intentional decision that the time is advantageous to fight a war that it has spent decades equipping and rehearsing for. Leaders start wars when they believe war will pay strategic dividends that couldn't be obtained through peaceful means, not because their anger got the better of them on a particular afternoon or because they couldn't find a working phone number for the White House. Beijing understands this better than Washington does, and it uses Washington's misapprehension to its advantage. In their first call after President Biden became president, Xi Jinping reportedly reintroduced the theme. Quote, I remember during one of our conversations years ago, you told me your father once said, the only thing worse than conflict that one intends is a conflict one does not intend, Xi Jinping reportedly said. It's reasonable to bet that Xi Jinping made that remark with forked tongue, that it was with the aim of stoking, not empathizing with President Biden's anxiety. Washington's fixation on unintentional conflict and hotlines may have emboldened Beijing to undertake more aggressive behavior, such as increasing its tempo of dangerously close intercepts of U.S. ships and planes in the South China Sea and in the Taiwan Strait. In orchestrating these close encounters, Beijing has a psychological advantage over Washington. It knows that accidents don't really lead to wars. The only references that I could find to accidental war in Chinese state media were commentaries noting how transfixed Washington is by the concept. Beijing may calculate that even a mid-air or at-sea collision with U.S. military entails limited downside risk, and appreciable upside potential, since it might persuade Washington, ever fearful of the mythic accidental war, to reduce its military patrols in the Western Pacific. There are a few other lessons of history that might sound counterintuitive, and I'd be happy to discuss them with Jeff when we start our conversation here in just a second. They include that overweening optimism about war is one of the key indicators that war is approaching. Another is that an equal balance of power between rivals is stabilizing. That's also a myth. It's actually quite the opposite. An equal balance of power between rivals is often the precondition for war. So I'd be happy to talk with you after Jeff and I have a conversation. But thanks again for having me today.
Thanks for those fantastic remarks, and congratulations on the publication of your book. It's a huge accomplishment.
Thank you.
Always a big accomplishment. I think this book in particular is going to make a big contribution to our understanding of the topic. And frankly, I want to dive right in, but I want to set the mood a little bit first.
Sure.
You probably would think with his book being published yesterday that we planned the timing of Matt speaking at the BC Lee lecture to promote his book. That's actually not the case. I reached out to Matt before we knew his book would be published this week because I thought he'd be a great candidate for this lecture, period. The reason for that is many people in Washington are now talking a very good game on China, and that is a positive development. I think there's a more realistic assessment of China in Washington these days. The number of people that have actually done something about the China threat from a position of power inside government is a much smaller group of people, and Matt is among them. You know, when Matt came into government, we were in a sad state of affairs. We were drunk on engagement. We were asleep at the wheel. You can pick whichever metaphor you like. The point is, our relationship with China was imbalanced and in a bad place, in my perspective. We had been thinking in terms of engagement for decades, and we were blinded by this theory that greater economic and political engagement with China would moderate its external behavior and make it more free at home. That's not the case, but in 2015, 2016, 2017, that wasn't widely accepted yet. China wants to have Huawei come and build our digital infrastructure. Well, sure, why not? Free trade, right? China wants to build outposts on dozens of US college campuses and call them Confucius Institutes. Yeah, sure, that seems like a good idea. There's a shady lab in Wuhan doing risky research on coronaviruses with no security. Let's give them $50 million and see what happens. This was the state of play for too long. And Matt and others in the Trump administration on this team said enough is enough. And they rebalanced our relationship with China in ways that were long overdue and necessary. They expanded our conception of competition beyond the military arena and recognized that this is as much an economic and technology competition as it is a military competition. They put Taiwan and deterrence in the Taiwan Strait at the center of our Indo-Pacific policy. They launched a global campaign against Huawei, not only to get them outside of the United States 5G network, but to warn our partners and allies about the risks of doing business. And on the alliance front, they made several important moves, including reviving the Quad and embracing the free and open Indo-Pacific concept, strengthening the alliance with Japan, and basically setting us on a much more positive trajectory in the Indo-Pacific. So for all of that, Matt, thank you. It was long overdue, necessary, and frankly, it's probably a testament to how wise many of these policies were that even the Biden administration came in and said, this just makes too much sense. We're not reversing course. So with that said, I am eager to dive in both to questions about your book, but also broader set of questions about the state of China policy and U.S. approach to Taiwan. And in fact, maybe we could start, of late, there has been a great debate generated by, I believe it was a series of foreign affairs articles.
Right.
And so I'll just very briefly say that it was yourself and Mike Gallagher, published in Foreign Affairs, and sort of a alternative perspective spearheaded by Elbridge Colby, and a debate about what the end state of U.S.-China policy should be. Mm-hmm. And I believe the simple characterization is that sort of the Bridge's position is that we should have sort of a managed competition with China, whereas you and Representative Gallagher were arguing for something closer to victory. But what that victory looks like is maybe been lost a bit in the debate. And I've seen people characterize your views and your perspective in ways that I think maybe aren't accurate. Maybe they don't understand what you and Representative Gallagher were getting at when you were advocating for victory. So could you give us a little insight into your perspective on what the end state should be?
Yeah, so Congressman Gallagher, who is an old friend. We'd served in the Marine Corps together. He's just recently left pretty remarkable service in Congress, in an amazing run, actually, and has done the country an enormous service. Even if you just look at what he was able to do galvanizing action against TikTok, I think that's one of the things that God willing, we'll be talking about years from now as one of the best foresighted sorts of steps that the U.S. has taken to prevent information warfare from being waged against us in pretty diabolical ways. Mike and I wrote that we should not be seeking to merely manage our competition, but actually to try to win it with Beijing. First, it's a recognition of the fact that Beijing is not playing for a stalemate. If what I just said didn't make that clear, you can read Xi Jinping's own speeches, the fact that he's waging proxy warfare against us in multiple theaters, more theaters possibly to come soon. He's not playing for a stalemate. Xi is not playing to manage a nice, happy balance of power with the United States. He's playing to win. So recognizing that, we define an end state that we believe would entail first and foremost persuading Xi Jinping and the party that he leads that they cannot win either a hot war against the United States and its allies and cannot win a cold war against the United States and its allies. That's the first major step towards victory. Now, some chose to characterize this as a call for regime change, even though we stated explicitly that it was not a call for subversion or regime change. But what we do point out, just as George Kennan pointed out, at the very beginning of the Cold War, as Harry Truman's strategy pointed out, as President Ronald Reagan's strategy at the far end of the Cold War pointed out, that if a Leninist dictatorship like the Soviet Union or today's People's Republic of China is unable to achieve its grand visions for global supremacy, that it might start to actually collapse from within. That's simply a statement of fact. It's not a call for the United States to launch a regime. I don't even know what a regime change policy would look like, quite frankly. But I think George Kennan was prescient when he described the likelihood that the Soviet Union, once contained and unable to achieve expansionist claims, would eventually start to fall apart from its own rotten weight. And that's exactly what played out. Mike and I thought it was important to point out that that is a possible future for the Chinese Communist Party. And I don't think we should fear it. We should simply recognize it and be ready for it in case that's the way that things come out. That may be a very long time in the future. It may be sooner than any of us can imagine. But I think that's sort of what we were looking at on the end state. Now there's the other part, which is what does managing the competition, what does engaging in competition look like in the near term? We think that though the Biden administration did, as you just mentioned, pick up on and continue with President Trump's policy, and in some places built upon it, especially in the area of export controls, targeting China's high-end semiconductor manufacturing ambitions. I think this is a very wise move by the Biden administration. Nonetheless, over the past year and a half or so, that policy has begun to slouch into what Mike and I call a détente policy. And détente, if you'll remember, in the 1970s, our détente policy towards the Soviet Union did not achieve the goals that it set out to achieve. It was a disappointing policy. Those who forged it, I think, were disappointed. Zbigniew Brzezinski, President Carter's national security advisor, actually in his memoirs talks about the fact that it was the nature of détente itself that may have led to some of the Soviet aggression that was playing out. And actually, Brzezinski helped President Carter pivot to a more hardline policy in the final year of the Carter administration. And that really was a preview to President Reagan's very effective policy that brought the Cold War to a peaceful end. It was an anti-détente policy that actually turned out to be most effective in dealing with the Soviet Union. I think the same is true today, that a détente policy is actually inviting aggression by signaling weakness. It also is failing to deprive the Chinese Communist Party of many of the sources of its confidence and economic strength that is feeding its increasingly aggressive ambitions. In short, the China policy, even of the Trump era, which was, I think, fine for that time, it was a very important shift that President Trump led, it's now out of date in light of the fact that Beijing is leading proxy wars against us and our allies in multiple theaters.
Very well said. My colleague Brian Burek calls it zombie engagement, this idea that just keeps resurfacing from the dead.
Mike Gallagher uses that phrase as well.
Okay.
It's a good phrase.
Yeah, and I think it's based on the idea that if we should halt our competitive actions in order to continue the dialogues, viewing dialogue itself as an end state. And that's been one of our sources of frustration with the Biden administration as well, is they seem to start off on the right foot, but very quickly fell back into this trap.
Well, what are the fruits of the Biden administration's reinvigorated intensive diplomacy, as they call it? What are the fruits of that? The Biden administration points to the Chinese military, which had suspended talks with us, not for the first time, is now talking to our military a little bit. Great. Okay. Second, they've said that this is going to lead to new cooperation, effective cooperation, stemming the flow of chemical death into our cities and communities in the form of fentanyl. I know that the Heritage Foundation is doing some important work right now on the fentanyl trade, and I'd also point you to the House Select Committee on China's recent report that points out that not only is China and its state-owned enterprises the main provider of the precursor chemicals that are turned into illegal fentanyl on our streets, but the Chinese government is heavily subsidizing that work. They're providing state subsidies for this form of chemical warfare against the United States. So I'm not seeing, in fact, the Washington Post had a recent report showing that even after President Biden had his meeting in San Francisco last fall with Xi Jinping, where they talked about fentanyl cooperation, it's business as usual for these companies that are dealing death into our communities, killing upwards of 80,000 Americans a year, to say nothing of all of the people who are alive but hooked on this stuff. The third thing they point to is cooperation on AI. And I actually agree with the Biden administration's view that artificial intelligence, we need to try to have a conversation with our adversaries about limits to the introduction of AI into things like nuclear weapons command and control systems, so that we don't end up with an actual, not just a theoretical accidental war. my impression is that those talks are not being taken seriously by the Chinese side. They sent a couple of foreign ministry mid-level officials to the first round of talks, didn't have anyone prepared to talk seriously about our concerns. And in fact, what the Chinese side was asking for was, we really want to just engage with American private businesses that are doing cutting-edge AI. So private businesses, beware, don't engage in so-called track 2 dialogues with the Chinese Communist Party on AI, particularly when they're not engaging the US on the laudable goal of trying to limit AI's introduction into weapons of mass destruction. So I don't think there's much to commend this managing competition policy. It has not yielded much of anything at all that's helpful to the United States.
Thank you for saying that, and thank you for mentioning the fentanyl problem. That's been particularly grating. As Matt mentioned, everyone here should be infuriated by the fact that 80,000 Americans a year are dying, and that the Chinese government is incentivizing the export of fentanyl precursor chemicals.
Remember, this was written in 1998. You had two People's Liberation Army, I think they were colonels, who wrote a very influential book in China called Unrestricted Warfare. And they called for waging warfare short of dropping bombs on the United States, but pursuing legal warfare, information warfare, including what they call public discourse warfare, waging psychological warfare. And one of the others was drugs, illicit drug trade. And fast forward 25 years, here we are.
Yeah. So there's so many fronts that have opened up now in this rivalry with China. One of the battles that we've been engaged here at Heritage is the need to get controls and prohibitions on U.S. outbound capital investments into China. Right? There are hundreds of billions of dollars of U.S. capital flowing into China every year, not just into China, into sanctioned Chinese military and technology companies with no transparency, virtually no restrictions. So that's been an ongoing battle in NDAA last year, and this year we're still fighting it somehow. I want to know what you think about the importance of that, but also broaden it out. There are so many fronts, and we have to prioritize. Where should we be focusing our energy? Let's say we get another crack at a new administration, a new attempt to reset China policy. You've got export controls, CFIUS reform, outbound, education, drugs. What are the top 3 priorities for you?
Well, look, a lot of the debate about prioritization ends up devolving just into discussion about geography. What geography matters more? I think we should not be looking at it in that sort of horizontal way, but vertically. We should be, first and foremost, prioritizing deterrence. And it's going to be a lot cheaper for us to deter in multiple theaters simultaneously than to deter really well in one theater, but accept major military defeats in other areas, because it's the same enemy. What I was talking about at the beginning, Xi Jinping has made a deliberate decision to materially support. In fact, in the words of our Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, who was in Beijing in April, he said, Beijing is overwhelmingly the #1 supporter of Russia's war in Europe. And he even said that it may have actually changed the course of that war, that Secretary Blinken has doubts about whether Russia would have been able to sustain that war, but for the material support to the military war machine from Beijing. So first and foremost, prioritize deterrence. And I think we've psyched ourselves out. There's this fatalism that has creeped into the dialogue. Partly this idea that, geez, what can we do? It's, Russia's a big country. China's a big country. Think about it this way. The United States, together with our allies, our treaty allies, other democracies, whether it's the NATO allies in Canada or we're talking about Japan and South Korea and the Philippines and Australia, combined, those democracies that are allied treaty partners of the United States are a $60 trillion economy each year. $60 trillion. Russia's a $2 trillion economy. $2 trillion. Are you kidding me? If you add Beijing and the other axis of chaos members like Iran, you add North Korea, throw in Venezuela, throw in Cuba for fun. You're looking at still about 1/3. All of those combined are about 1/3 of the $60 trillion Democratic alliance. I think we can dig a little deeper, okay? If we're spending almost $5 trillion in new spending, as the Biden administration has spent on stuff that has nothing to do with our defense, I think we can dig a little deeper to add on to our $800 billion defense budget. By the way, our defense budget, I did a back of the envelope. It's about equal to the combined military spending now of Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, those four. If you accept the American Enterprise Institute, sorry, I've mentioned them twice now at Heritage, but if you look at the AEI's report recently about what China's really spending on its military, somewhere around $700 billion, and then you add what Russia's doing, it's about equal to what the United States spends. Why are we not accepting the idea that we have a massive asymmetric advantage in our ability to spend more as an alliance, not just the United States, but as allies, to blunt this war machine that's being inflicted on Europeans, on Israelis, soon perhaps in Latin America and Venezuela, against Guyana, against the Philippines, against Taiwan.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you mentioned the Philippines because I think I have time for one more question, and that was my question. Very disturbed by recent developments in the South China Sea, particularly around Second Thomas Shoal. The Chinese are getting increasingly aggressive and belligerent toward a U.S. treaty ally. What would be your prescription for resolving the dispute there? Have you considered the possibility of sort of joint U.S. resupply missions with the Philippines to Second Thomas Shoal? What do we need to do?
I certainly think we should be ready to do that. I hope we're ready to do that, sort of a Berlin airlift to keep those Marines, those Philippine Marines on Second Thomas Shoal and on some of these other islets supplied. But I think we also need to be thinking about asymmetric, parallel costs that need to be. What costs have we put on Beijing for its actions? Beijing has made a mockery of international law and traditional laws of the sea. Even though they're a signatory to some of these treaties, they have ignored court rulings that found that Beijing's in the wrong around Second Thomas Shoal. What costs have been imposed on Beijing for that? I think there need to be military costs. It might mean that we are working together with the Philippines to put far more capability in place on the Philippines to threaten the Chinese Navy in any contingency, not just one against the Philippines, but against the Philippines' neighbors like Taiwan. It might mean a lot more in the way of economic measures. But right now, Beijing sees it can do this with impunity. And why is Beijing targeting this little islet to begin with? It's mainly about trying to discredit the United States. It's a dress rehearsal for Taiwan. They're doing it on a little tiny model of Taiwan, which is this little islet called Second Thomas Shoal that doesn't make most of the world's advanced semiconductors, that is not, by itself a major geostrategically important spot. But what they're doing is trying to demonstrate that they can blockade, create a sense of futility, and discredit the idea that the United States is going to help not only the Philippines, but by extension Taiwan. After all, the Philippines is a mutual defense treaty ally of the United States. We don't have a formal alliance with Taiwan. So if Beijing can basically demonstrate that we're feckless over this little rock in the West Philippine Sea, it sends a pretty dire message about Taiwan's situation. So I think, as I said in my opening remarks, Beijing has already attacked to such a degree that it should trigger our mutual defense treaty response. If President Marcos and in discussion with President Biden decide that would be the best course. I'm not saying that means we go to war. I'm saying we need to acknowledge that that's what's happening and start imposing much more serious costs. They don't have to be ship-to-ship types of things that we do. It can be things that actually take advantage of Beijing's vulnerabilities.
Thanks, Matt. We have some time for audience questions. We've got one right here.
Prashant Jha of the Hindustan Times. I have a question on India. If we could go back to your time in office, could you give us a flavor of how you saw the India relationship? Because you were in office when India and China had this direct face-off in Eastern Ladakh, and US played a supportive role. Could you then give us a sense of how you assess the Biden administration's approach to India? And finally, how the next administration should deepen the relationship with India, and what your expectations from India?
Sure. Well, look, I think that, Jeff mentioned that during the Trump administration, we reinvigorated the Quad. We began convening Quad meetings at the minister level. And I was thrilled that the Biden administration picked up where we left off and actually elevated to the leader level, the Quad. I think that was a really good move. We, I think, had a pretty good working relationship over the course of the Trump administration with India, including at the leader level. President Trump and Prime Minister Modi would, got on quite famously up in Gujarat at this giant, and then down in Texas, they were in stadiums filled with people from both of our countries. So I think there's a really good foundation to build on. I think President Biden and his team have done pretty well on this score. If you go back to the summer of 2020, remember this is the COVID summer. That's when Chinese troops attacked India. They, similar to what's going on with the Philippines right now, they kept their weapons behind, their firearms, but picked up axes and knives and barbed wire wrapped, pieces of steel and bludgeoned to death Indian soldiers, and some of those Chinese soldiers died in the melee. So what Beijing's trying to do is keep pushing the envelope without creating the perception that it's war, simply because they're using medieval and barbaric tactics as opposed to advanced firearms. So we worked closely with India to provide some indirect support to help India shore up its border and defend its sovereignty. Look, I think that there's, if whether President Biden or President Trump is reelected for a second term, I think we should be a lot more ambitious about the U.S.-India relationship in a second term. I think we need to get a lot more ambitious, but that's a longer discussion.
Yeah. I'd agree, Matt. Back here. Give it a second.
Yeah, Japan is increasingly concerned about the aggressiveness of China around Taiwan in particular. And we keep seeing reports that the U.S. has, for the first time since '79, stationed troops on Taiwan. Can you confirm a little bit of that? And is that a good idea going forward?
Who has troops on Taiwan?
U.S. troops. We keep seeing reports that U.S. has troops on Taiwan for the first time since 1979. And is that a good idea? And going forward, your thoughts on keeping U.S. military in Taiwan?
Well, look, I don't know the details of exactly what U.S. troops rotate in and out to do training and so forth. What I would say is that we've been training Taiwan's military nonstop, even after the 1979 shift of recognition to the People's Republic of China. Taiwan's Air Force is trained in the United States all along. They've got some of their F-16s, and they go head-to-head in training with U.S. pilots. It only makes sense that we would deepen the quality of our planning and training with Taiwan, and that we would start to involve other partners as well, including Japan, especially Japan, but also Australia. And some of that should probably intensify in part because of what Beijing's doing around Second Thomas Shoal in the West Philippine Sea. That should be one of the consequences. I think we should be doing much more serious multilateral planning together with Taiwan, much more intensive training. But for details on what training's going on right now, I'm not the right person to give you the latest.
One down here.
Thank you. My name is Kevin. One of my questions I wanted to ask was, how can we get, since our support for Ukraine and Israel has seen a lot of backlash, people are angry about it. What if, how do we get the people support on, our aid to Taiwan if anything were to happen?
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, we're dealing with tentacles of an octopus now, right? And so it doesn't make sense for us to say, well, let's ignore the tentacle that's grabbing a big chunk of Europe, or let's ignore the one that's now starting to squeeze the Philippines, and just focus on the tentacle that's starting to surround Taiwan, okay? Because it's the same frickin' octopus, okay? This is an axis with Beijing at the center. That doesn't mean that Beijing launched all of these wars and conflicts, but it's definitely exploiting them to its advantage. It sees a strategic design in supporting the war like Tony Blinken described when he was in Beijing recently. So I would say to anyone that, this isn't the last one. The worse we do at deterrence, the weaker need we are about imposing costs on this kind of aggression, the more the aggression will intensify in the places where fighting is already happening, and the more it will spread to other theaters where we're not seeing fighting yet, but it's coming, okay? I mean, if we've learned anything, if you go back, think for a moment about, I think it was 2014, or was it 2013, that the United States drew a red line around Bashar al-Assad and said, if you use chemical weapons against your own people, in fact, it was 2013. It was August of 2013. If you use chemical weapons against your own people, we're going to take military action. Bashar al-Assad then went on to do his worst. You saw the images of children coughing up their lungs and dying, his own people, from chemical war. The United States decided not to enforce the red line that we'd drawn. It was exactly 6 months after that the war in Ukraine began, that Crimea played out, okay? Now, fast forward to Afghanistan and the US retreat in the summer of 2021. It was exactly 6 months after that Vladimir Putin launched the new phase of his 10-year war, the all-out effort to try to decapitate the capital. And hundreds of thousands of people have died since. Thousands are dying today. So there's a lesson in this, right? I mean, it's what I mean when I say deterrence is cheaper than war. And I don't think that we can say, well, we're going to deter some adversaries in some places, but not others, when in fact those adversaries are operating as an axis, increasingly well-coordinated axis. So well-coordinated that North Korea is sending troops to fight in Europe? Are you kidding me?
So, Matt, maybe I could offer the next question with a little bit of gentle pushback. Because I agree with a lot of what you say, but let's assume for a moment that the theaters are connected. And we've got maybe a secondary theater in Europe that is connected in some way to China, and the primary theater in the Indo-Pacific. I think a source of frustration for a lot of people, including folks here at Heritage and even myself, is that it's easy to get resources for the secondary theater, but somehow the primary theater always comes in second. So we've got something happening in the secondary theater, and we can muster $150 billion for it. Mm-hmm. But the primary theater, the center of the conflict, the Taiwan Strait, we kick and scratch and claw for a decade, and we get $2 billion. Yeah. That's a huge source of frustration.
For me too. For me too. So what I'm saying is enlarge the pie, and then give the Western Pacific a much bigger slice. We've been arguing for that. Mike Gallagher and I, in our foreign affairs piece that you mentioned, talk about a $20 million Indo-Pacific fund just to go help provide the Indo-Pacific commander with some of those unfunded requirements that he and his predecessor have delivered to the Pentagon. The Pentagon right now isn't even spending the money that it's being allocated by Congress. I don't want to get the figure wrong, but I think it's about $11 billion a year that isn't being allocated. That money alone would go a really long way in the Western Pacific to shoring up our defense. Again, remember, President Biden net increase of U.S. spending by $4.6 trillion, not 1 cent of it for defense. Our defense budget is shrinking for 3 years in a row. In real terms, we have a shrinking defense budget. We have the smallest U.S. active duty military that we've had since the eve of World War II. I agree that we need to be a lot better about how we spend. We need to be more efficient. But let's start by facing the fact that we are in a major crisis, a 1930s-style crisis, and we're making decisions that we don't need to be making about a small amount of resources when we can increase that amount of resources.
I think we have time for one more, and I feel bad because I called on him earlier and we gave the mic to someone else. Don't worry, you're doing a good job.
No, thank you. Christian Forstner, Hans Seidel Foundation, which is a conservative think tank in Munich. If you present, Matt, your strategic objectives, managed competition or victory to European allies, what would you expect? I expect they would opt for managed competition, but not for victory.
Sure.
So what role for the transatlantic partnership you see in the Indo-Pacific U.S.-China relationship?
Yeah. Well, look, when I first came into office in early 2017, I made it a focus, even though I was the senior director for the Asia Directorate, I spent a lot of time, and my team spent a lot of time engaging with Europe about China. And what we found was, at the beginning, an extremely skeptical audience in Europe that didn't even want to say that China was a strategic competitor, much less an adversary that's waging proxy war against Europe today. But over time, what we did not do, what we did was say, we're going to do what we're going to do because we believe it's in the best interest of the United States. By the way, we also think it's in the best interest of Europe, so we're moving forward. We're going to keep you apprised every step of the way. We're going to tell you what we're doing, why we're doing it, why we hope you will do similar things, and we'll be thrilled if you come to see the world in similar ways to how we're now seeing it. And lo and behold, over time, Europe's rhetoric started to change. You saw that several countries and people within many of the countries started to say, we know what you're talking about. We're now looking harder. We're seeing that Beijing is conducting United Front influence operations against our universities, or to steal our intellectual property, or to intimidate citizens of German citizens who, whether they're ethnic Chinese or not, in your own society. And lo and behold, eventually, I think Europe began to move in a similar direction. Europe's going to do things its way. Europe is run by Europe. It's not for the United States to dictate. But what I don't think the answer is for the United States to say, well, because Europe is not fully on board yet with the problems we're seeing, the United States is going to wait. We're going to hold back, and we're actually going to water down our rhetoric. We're going to water down our steps so that we're all in lockstep. That's not leadership. That's the opposite of leadership. And it's more likely that you're going to end up with nothing really happening very quickly. But look at Europe's rhetoric and actions today. Look, Ursula von der Leyen, who made that very important speech a year ago that was followed up with what she called de-risking. I welcome it. It's great. Personally, I prefer stronger language. I think the United States should use stronger language. But I commend her for having the courage to at least start imposing some costs through the form of tariffs and other things against Beijing's malign strategy. Beijing wants to render Europe in chaos, and it wants the United States to eventually be irrelevant. So if you look at, for example, that series of books that Ian Easton, who's a scholar here in town, discovered, these are National Defense University textbooks for China's generals. These are top party members, Chinese Communist Party members who are also military top brass. It's the Xi Jinping Thought series of textbooks. And one of the passages in those textbooks says, this is a 2018 passage. It says, America's growing weaker, Russia's growing more aggressive, Europe will be in chaos, and this is going to be great for China. In short, that's the paraphrase, right? It said that these are preconditions, in essence, for China's rise. And so what's following since then is what is the strategy we're seeing play out right now. Beijing is trying to shatter Europe, shatter it into a bunch of little pieces of crystal. Yeah. Thanks.
Wow. Excellent. Everybody, join me in a round of applause for Matt. Go out. I don't know if I'm allowed to say this. Go out, buy his book. Read his backstory, fascinating journey from Wall Street Journal reporter in Asia to serving combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Say one thing about the book, which I co-wrote and am the editor of, is really a military discussion. It's not an economic war, deterrent strategy. It's not a diplomatic strategy. But what we argue, my co-authors and I, is that in the absence of credible military hard power, none of those other elements of our power are going to work effectively. So anyway, I welcome your critiques and disagreements and all the rest. So thanks for coming. Yeah.
Thanks.